Hello and welcome back to the course Private Pilot Maneuvers. Last time we did a normal takeoff, so we're just taking off directly into the wind, or maybe there's no wind at all. But today we'll talk about crosswind takeoffs. Now a runway always has the same direction. So it's a pretty lucky coincidence actually if the wind is exactly on your nose. In many cases you will have some crosswind component. Sometimes it's only very little, 2 or 3 knots if the wind is light, so it's really not much of a big deal. But sometimes at some airports this happens more often due to the orographical situation or just the prevailing wind systems. So you need to know how to do a crosswind departure. First of all, you should know your limits. So in the pilot's operating handbooks, normally there is no actual crosswind limit. It's just a demonstrated crosswind component. So that's what was demonstrated during testing. Actually not a hard limit, but it's of course advisable to keep within this value. For the Cessna 152, for example, the maximum demonstrated crosswind component is 12 knots. So that's not too much actually. In many small airplanes it's 15 knots, sometimes even 20. Okay, so if you can, of course, it's preferably to take off directly into the wind, but very often you have to deal with some crosswind. Now, of course, it's important to know how much crosswind there is actually, because you can get a wind reading from the tower on a controlled airport, from the ATIS, or some other automated weather observation. You can also simply look at the windsock, of course, and you will get a general idea where the wind is coming from. But if you, let's say, have 20 knots total wind speed and it's coming from directly your front left direction, how much crosswind is that? That's of course important to know, because you need to know your crosswind component to be able to tell if you're within your limits. If you get the wind by tower, this is normally magnetic. And if you get a wind, for example, from a weather report, a routine weather report like a METAR, then this will be in degrees true. Just keep that in mind. If you're somewhere where there's big variation of maybe 10 degrees, then you need to take into account this difference. Okay, so before you depart, check the general wind direction, the overall wind direction, and then calculate your crosswind component. Normally there are charts in the pilot's operating handbook, like one you can see behind me. One really important thing to remember about that is that the crosswind component is actually depending on the sign of the angle, of the crosswind angle. So what that means is, if you have a crosswind that's exactly coming, or you have a total wind direction that's exactly 45 degrees off your nose, of let's say 10 knots, intuitively you would say, okay, that's just from a 45-degree angle, so it must be half. So the crosswind component is 5 knots. But that's not true, as it's depending on the sign. For example, this is also what you can see in the chart just to my right, that at 60 degrees, at an angle of 60 degrees, it's the sign is approximately 0.9. So you would, at 60 degrees crosswind wind angle, you already have, with a 10 knots total wind speed, a crosswind component of 9 knots. And it's already half at 30 degrees. So you have the wind just 30 degrees off your nose. Then you also already have half of it as a crosswind component. So let's say I have 15 knots, just 30 degrees off my nose. Then I will already have 8 knots, about 8 knots crosswind component. So just keep that in mind. Either you know the sign for some important wind directions, some important angles. It's not too difficult to remember. Then There's also a rule of thumb, so to speak, that's a little bit less accurate, but is normally sufficient for normal flight operations, and that is to regard the angles as times. Now, what do I mean by that? Well, an hour has 60 minutes. So with 60 minutes, the hour is full. With 30 minutes, it's a half hour. And so on. So if I have a wind that's coming 60 degrees off my nose, then I have 60 minutes, the hour is full, then I already take this as a full crosswind component. So 10 knots to 60 degrees off my nose, I'll count as 10 knots as a full crosswind actually. For example, as I've said before, if I have a wind of 10 knots coming 30 degrees off my nose, well, 30 minutes is half an hour, so I take half of it. So 10 knots from 30 degrees off my nose is 5 knots crosswind component. Actually gets me on the safe side. Also, it's good to have some margin because maybe during my takeoff roll the wind gets a bit stronger and the crosswind component actually increases. Okay, so that's how you determine your crosswind component. That's also important. And then let's look at the procedure. Now the takeoff roll itself is actually the same, except that you will need aileron into the wind, because the crosswind will want to lift the upwind wing. So we need to create some downward force on that wing, and that we do by applying aileron, stick or yoke into the wind to keep that wing down. Because if you let the wing rise, then you have even more surface exposed to the crosswind, and then small bounces will start that are called skipping, and they will produce quite some stress for the landing gear, so that should be avoided. Then keep in mind the weather vaning tendency of the airplane. So the nose of the airplane will want to turn into the wind. So if you have a wind from the left, crosswind, the nose will tend to turn to the left. If you have a wind from the right, it will turn to the right. It always will try to turn into the wind. But then, in addition to that, you have the propeller effects, like in every takeoff. As we've heard, with a normally clockwise rotating propeller, you will have the nose wanting to go to the left. So if you now have an additional left crosswind, the nose will even more tend to go to the left. But if on the other hand you have a right crosswind, then those effects may kind of cancel each other out. So just be aware of that. You have, with a crosswind component, you also have weather vaning tendency that will want to turn the nose of the airplane into the wind. So you need a rudder to compensate for that. In general, during these crosswind conditions, you will have the ailerons and the rudder deflected in some way, so we will have a bit more drag than in a normal departure, and you should keep in mind your performance, keep it in mind in your performance calculations. So here you can see the entire procedure of a crosswind departure. Now at the start of the takeoff roll, you can actually apply some considerable amount of aileron into the wind, and then keep in mind that as you get faster, the controls will become more effective, so you need less and less aileron. But just don't do that mechanically, but really feel the airplane and just apply that much aileron pressure so that the aircraft keeps aligned laterally with the runway. As I've said before, you start the takeoff roll, take another look at the windsock to check if the conditions are actually what you expected, or to see how much crosswind there actually is. And then after liftoff, you will have this transition from this slip, where you have aileron into the wind, to a normal crab angle, where you just have the nose pointed into the wind, and you will keep then your desired track above the ground. Now, if you do it correctly during the takeoff, it may happen that because of the aileron into the wind, that one wheel is lifting off before the other one, but that's completely acceptable. It's really preferable to skipping. So better lift the one wheel off first, that's fine. In a very strong crosswind, it's also advisable to maybe lift off a little bit later, so build up a little more speed. This will give you more positive control than after liftoff. All right, now, so what are the common errors during crosswind takeoffs? First of all, too little or inadequate aileron pressure. So really feel the airplane, try to keep it centered laterally on the runway, but just the amount of aileron you need. And then as you get faster and faster, less and less aileron normally is required. If the wind is staying the same, of course. Also, inadequate rudder control is often a problem, especially if you have a strong left crosswind, for example. In addition to the propeller effects, you will have a lot of tendency for the nose to go left, so be ready to really counteract this with maybe a lot of right rudder. Another common mistake is to have then too much aileron input still at the end of the takeoff roll, and after liftoff you will get into a steep bank right away. And then another mistake is that often after liftoff, the drift correction is neglected. Keep in mind that after liftoff, you will need to establish a crab angle into the wind so that you keep your runway track after departure. What often happens is that there's then too little crab angle established and the airplane is drifting to the side with the wind. All right, so this concludes the briefing about crosswind takeoffs. So let's find ourselves some crosswind and try this. See you in the airplane.